So far, earlier this morning, I've seen probably about 10-12 male packs fighting inch males, moving from Carangol to Loiclay and back, from Loiclay back into Carangol shot area. And every time we go into Carangol, they say there's no males that live there, but we're watching males come in and out of houses right now.
The fellow that acted as the translator was a U.S. soldier, and did they have Afghani soldiers working with our troops at all?
They're all American forces over there, except maybe the SEALs or something. But all regular forces have units of ANA, Afghan National Army, attached with them. U.S. soldiers cannot enter an Afghan household. Only Afghans can do that. Afghan soldiers. It's also a way of training them. Training the Afghans. And the translators were Afghan. They were not Americans. They were Afghan. Sometimes they wore, sort of cast-off American clothing or whatever. But they were Afghans. And there was a series of different translators. So it wasn't all, always one guy. But the issue of translation, it's eternally an issue for any force, any group that's operating in another country. And the negotiations are only as good as the translation is. And I think most of the translators sort of meant well and tried to do a good job. But who knows? Like, I don't speak Pashto, I have no idea. And Dan Kearney didn't either. And then sometimes Dan, I've worked overseas a lot, and I'm used to working with translators, so I know that you say a sentence, maybe you say 2 sentences, and then you stop. Because otherwise, if you just speak for 5 minutes and the translator then translates, he's not getting the nuance of what you're saying, and so all of that like carefully worded diplomacy just goes right down the drain. And Dan I would sort of watch this, and Dan just didn't quite know that, and but he was new to this too, and but it was sort of interesting. Like, that is, I think, in some ways the Achilles heel of the whole counterinsurgency effort. It all depends on the accurate, faithful translation of some very young guys, some very young Afghan translators who, they might sometimes, I think, are in over their heads as well.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering.
Hey babe, I miss you.
It takes a little bit out of you every time you see one of your boys get hurt. It's really like a big family.
If you're still in touch with these men, you know how they're faring as they return home?
Are we still in touch with the guys and how they're faring? Yeah, we are in touch with them a lot. We created a very, also, some of them we speak to on the phone regularly, some through Facebook. Most of them went out and redeployed. The funny thing is about it is that it's very hard for people to understand back home, but it's like if you're a soldier and you're in a place like Restrepo, they come back and that they miss it. That's really hard for people to understand. How could you possibly miss it? And yet, it's not just, there's an illusion, I think, that's created because of, say, war films and stuff, or, Hollywood war film, this idea of the adrenaline. I think what they're missing is this sense of brotherhood and the significance and meaning that they have out there, and that group brings them. And so when they come out to the States, it's like they're like, I got to go back. They all redeployed. And it's really crazy to think about that they've had some of the most kind of, most significant, they're having existential crises out there in some kind of way. Having your best friend being killed in your arms, or dealing with issues of killing somebody, or being, those issues are something that we don't all deal with necessarily in life, or we deal with as we get older. And here they are, average age 18 to 20, dealing with that. So we have stayed in touch with them, and we're back out to Afghanistan in March and April, so we're hoping to see some of them again, catch up with them. And a lot of them came back, and when we did the Italy interviews, they were, they're, unfortunately, medication plays a big role, as Cortez said. I think there were something like 70% of the guys when we were in Afghanistan were on some form of medication. The U.S. military is so stretched that has been so stretched. I think now the pressure's a little bit off now that the numbers in Iraq have gone down. And when we went back out to Italy, it was like that rate had gone up higher, and they were, obviously struggling with. I think Battle Company, when we went out there, a fifth of all fighting in the whole of the country was taking place in that 6-mile-long valley. 70% of American bombs were being dropped, and Battle Company was taking a 25% casualty rate. Chosen Company, which was in another valley, which had a less firefight ratio. I mean, I think Battle Company had about 350 firefights during the year's deployment in the Korangal, which is a lot. And Chosen Company had a much less rate of firefights, but had 80% casualties. There was one patrol to a place called Aranas, where I think it was 28 people.
28 men.
28 men on the patrol. Everybody took a bullet. Everybody's either killed or wounded. The wounded held off the attackers. So they come back, and it's like they've been through a lot, and that's what's weird. Then they feel like they don't belong back home. They find it so hard to readjust. So I mean, part of what we wanted in making the film was to just explore this emotional terrain, because ultimately we just felt like people at home need to understand that territory, because ultimately they're coming back here, and we need to kind of help them come back. So yeah.
Kept on running, and I saw 3 guys, and there was 2 guys carrying one guy, and the one had his arms and the other had his legs. I only knew one of them, and it wasn't the one that I wanted to know. It was Brennan, and he was the one being carried away. So just fucking running and shooting, trying to close the gap with him. I shot at both of them. I killed one, I guess, at the end, but the other one I shot the shit out of. I tried to, but didn't see him, and by the time my magazine was already empty, I was at Brennan. Already at Brennan. So just grabbed Brennan. I yelled for Sergeant Gallardo that they're fucking taking him. Like, what the fuck?
This time's okay.
Yeah.
You just answered the question partially, but I just wondered, have you had any of the same issues, the nightmares or that kind of stuff?
Yeah, the question is, have Tim and I suffered some of the same emotional consequences of combat? I mean, 2 of the most traumatic things about combat, I think, are the sort of crisis that comes with the knowledge that you've killed someone, particularly a civilian. I think that's a really agonizing thing for most people. And I think that's a major problem in Iraq, where the insurgency is being fought really inside a civilian population. And another really traumatic thing is losing a very good friend, someone you love, often right in front of your eyes. And Tim and I knew guys who were killed out there, but none of those guys were people that we were extremely close to. Thank God, because that would have been extremely, just really, really hard to imagine dealing with successfully. And obviously we weren't carrying weapons and didn't have to do with the moral issues surrounding killing. But that said, yeah, combat is scary and it's traumatic, and any kind of trauma affects you, sometimes for quite a while. And so, I had plenty of nightmares afterwards. I had nightmares when I was up there. You'd have combat dreams in the middle of the night where you dreamed that the outpost was getting overrun and you were hearing gunfire, and you'd just, leap out of your bunk, and then everyone else is asleep and you realize it's just a dream. And those kinds of dreams for me continued for quite a long time. And things go away eventually, and those did too. But when we were making the movie, we were really just immersed in the process, immersed in the story, and I was also writing about it. There was 3 or 4 months where I was in the Korangal every night in my dreams. Every night I went back there in my head, and also, just last thing is, it made me, and the soldiers reported this as well. It was really interesting, and it's not talked about much, but it made me very emotional, and not in a bad way. I was just more emotional. I was emotionally opened up, and I would get choked up about things that ordinarily I would barely notice. I would be moved by things like weddings that ordinarily I would just be sitting there politely, And the same thing happened to quite a few of the soldiers in the platoon, and they were even kind of puzzled about it. They're like, we're crying at stupid stuff. Like what, you know, it's like in their minds, the way they put it was, we're turning into girls. Like what's happening? And I actually, I was mentioning that at a talk that I gave once, and someone came up to me, a woman came up to me, and she was a psychologist, and she said that she is actually, it's a known, she deals with soldiers, with veterans, and she said that it's a known thing. Everyone knows PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, but there's an associated thing called post-traumatic growth, and it's the sort of emotional opening up that can come with trauma. In other words, it's not all negative. There also is a kind of positive fallout, and I definitely experienced that.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. Sebastian, Tim, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I still obviously haven't figured out how to deal with it inside. The only hope I have right now is that eventually I'll be able to process it differently. I'm never gonna forget it. I don't wanna not have that as a memory, because that was one of the moments that makes me appreciate everything that I have.